Well, Barnabas Piper is my guest. Barnabas, you are my first repeat guest on my show. How does that make you feel?
Well, I mean, being the first, it's such a high honor. I don't know. I don't know how I should feel. It feels momentous.
We are just about a year into the show, so I guess it's kind of a big deal. You're my first repeat guest so far, but
It,
basically,
it
yeah,
it means one of two things. It either means I did really well the first time, or you have a very short list of people you have access to. I'm not sure which.
I think maybe a mixture of both. My reach has expanded a little bit. I think since I've started this show, I've had a lot of people on here that I didn't know before I started it, so that's been good. But yeah, we talked basically right at the start of the quarantine. Actually, it wasn't even we weren't even quarantined yet. It was just kind of like we were learning
Yeah,
about COVID.
it was like the COVID news was breaking, and none of us quite knew what that meant.
I'm not even sure. Maybe the NBA shut down at that point, and baseball had not shut down, I don't think. But yeah, it was right at the very beginning of it in March whenever we talked, and did not think that here in October we would still be dealing with it. But nonetheless, here we are. How are you holding up? How's this year been since the start of that until where we're at now?
It doing well for me. Obviously I feel like I've had a very different kind of year than a lot of people because I got engaged in January. COVID obviously hit in March. I got married mid COVID in July. I've had a couple things published this year, which a couple things republished and then a couple new things published. So it's just kind of been a full year of, well, this is exciting, which I feel guilty saying because it's been a really terrible year for a lot of people. On the COVID front, it really has been, it's been there was a dip at the beginning where it was just everybody was constantly like, how do we deal with this? And now it feels sort of like a new version of normal, or
Yeah,
at least most people have arrived at a place of we know how to cope with this. You kind of have your safe circle. These are the things we're comfortable doing. These are the things we're not comfortable doing. That's a tighter circle for some and a bigger circle for others. And at least in the groups of people I'm connected to, there tends to be a fair amount of graciousness. So if somebody's not comfortable doing something, others aren't, causing them shame and guilt for that. And
yeah.
so it works out and, still have friends, still have family and chugging away.
Yeah, you and I we met earlier this year at a Starbucks near Nashville, and we were talking about your upcoming marriage or your upcoming wedding, and that was well before we knew anything about COVID. And you were talking about
Right.
planning for it and everything. We went to a couple weddings this summer. One was outdoors, and people were in masks. Actually, both of them were outdoors, and people were wearing masks and all that. But did you have to change anything about your
Oh
wedding at
yeah.
all?
Yeah. So during May and June, Nashville, where I live, started to kind of reopen. So they went total shutdown.
Yeah.
Then they started to reopen in phases. And so I think it was in June, maybe. No, it must have been in May. They opened up to a phase that would have allowed for a gathering of people of the size that we wanted for our wedding. So over 100 people, something like that.
Yeah.
And then the day after our RSVPs were due, so we found out, okay, there's going to be 120 whatever people who are going to come. The day after that, Nashville rolled back phases. And so we had to uninvite people. And rather than trying to pick favorite friends, we just delayed the celebration uh, reception part to next year,
Okay.
praying that next year will look very different than this year. And then just had a very small family ceremony, and it was beautiful and great. There was a hard adjustment from preparing to celebrate with all of our, all the friends who could make it, and to just family. But
Yeah.
once we made this sort of mental emotional transition, we were able to enjoy it. And a wedding is a wedding. It's not just a party. So it was great in and of itself.
Yeah.
And then, Lord willing, we have the big party next year.
Yeah, let's hope. Let's hope to God we're not still talking about this next year. Hopefully,
Yeah,
next time if we talk again next year, you'll be able to talk about your actual reception.
right,
That'll be
exactly.
good. So one of the reasons I wanted to get you back on here is just to kind of talk about the writing process. As you mentioned, you've had several things published this year, including a new book that just came out at the beginning of October, "Hoping for Happiness." And on top of you being a writer, you've also worked in the publishing field. And there are a lot of people that listen to the show that are writers that are curious about the writing process, curious about the publishing process. And there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. It's not just as easy as sitting down, writing a book, and then sending it off and getting it published. There's a lot of other layers to it that if you don't do your research, it can be kind of jarring or surprising as a writer to know that there's a lot that goes into it. So, you've got a lot of experience in this field. This is, I think, your fourth original
Yeah.
book that's been
So yeah,
published.
I've done, 4 books, and then one group Bible study that came out this year
Okay.
attached to my book, Help My Unbelief. So it's kind of a book, but it's like 6 sessions designed to go through with a group. So
Right.
basically 5 publications.
So you've got, I mean, a wealth of knowledge of how to, and your father obviously has published a ton of books as well. So you've been around this industry for, most of your life. So, whenever you, I guess, think back to your first book that you wrote, and maybe your process has changed. I assume it's changed throughout the different books and that kind of thing. But what did you learn, I guess, from the start, whenever you were writing your first book, and what have you learned since then that I guess has been some of the more valuable tricks of the trade, I guess, about the publishing industry and the writing industry?
Yeah, the writing itself hasn't changed dramatically. I mean, I think I've improved as a writer. I think as you write more, you get better at gauging yourself. So you get into there's fewer panic days where you're like, I don't have anything to say. It's a terrible day. It's the end of the world. And you just kind of go, yeah, today's a bad day, because you end up transitioning to the recognition that writing is work.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that as in drudgery, but like it takes consistency, it takes discipline, it takes effort. So a bad writing day is just like a bad day at the office.
Yeah.
Some days are like that. So you pack it up and you go home and you get your sleep and you come back in the next day, and next day might be better. Yeah. And so the writing itself has improved just by practice, by maturity of voice. I think finding a voice as a writer is a hard thing, and saying what is your voice as a writer is a really nebulous concept, but I think it's essentially where you are comfortable in your own skin as a writer. You're not trying to sound like somebody else. Nothing feels forced. Just the words are yours. Communicating, whether it's a story or an idea or whatever. On the publishing side, so my most recent book that just came out early in October is called Hoping for Happiness. And it was the first book that I've had to pitch around to multiple publishers. So it was a new experience for me, but having been on the publishing side and then knowing other authors, it's a really common thing. But it was the first one that I had multiple publishers say, we don't think this is right for us, or it's not the right thing. They all use euphemistic language. I don't know if it means they didn't think the book was right, or my last book didn't sell well enough. All of these are factors in it. So that was one. It was the first time I went through that process. Prior to that, my first 2 books were on a single contract. So I was able to work that out with David C. Cook at the time. My third book, I should say, my second contract was with a publisher I worked for at the time. So I had a bit of an insider connection there. Yeah. And again, sometimes, I mean, connections are the best way to do anything. If you have connections, just bring them all the way out.
Yeah.
And then earn the right to have them. That's the key part. You don't ask for favoritism. You ask for a seat in the room, and then you earn the right to be in the room. So by writing the best possible thing you can. And so this one was the first one that I was kind of a writing free agent, and I didn't love that process. I understood it, and so I wasn't anxious about it, but I wasn't crazy about hearing from publishers their feedback on it when I was 100% sure they were wrong. Yeah. Which every author is. You get rejected and you're like, well, you're an idiot, So yeah, which I've been on the rejecting side of things, and I'm sure authors have those feelings towards me, or had them at some point. So I think that process was a new one. I think the other thing that I've observed over the course of, so my first book came out in 2014. So it's been 6 or 7 years, has been the increase in the demand on an author to market their own books. Yeah. 10 years ago and earlier, a publisher was the primary marketing avenue, and the author brought maybe something to the table. But with the rise of social media and the decline of retail, in terms of like storefront retail, authors now carry the weight for that. And it's just something authors have to get used to. It's also now part of the decision-making process in publishing. Yeah. Can you market your own book? What is your reach? What is your audience? That dirty word platform, which I hate so much.
It's like every author says they hate that word. Every author's like, oh, I just cringe when I hear the word platform.
Well, because what you would like is, in a perfect world, the best books get published and the best books sell. We know full well this is not a perfect world, and
Yeah.
so the best books don't get published all the time. Sometimes they rise to the top. I mean, publishers will rarely turn down a transcendent book. Most of us don't write those, though. Most of us write decent books. And so, yeah, like my stuff gets published over somebody else who's probably an equivalent writer because of my last name, because of my previous publishing experience, because of my social media following, my podcast, my whatever, all of which says nothing about the quality of the book.
Yeah.
It just says how many people can I get it in front of, which publishers have to take into account. So that's the frustrating side of the authoring experience. There's the rejection aspect, just trying to get in the door. Then there's once you're in the door, you have to sell this thing yourself to a pretty significant extent.
Yeah. And you hit on something there too, because it can be a tough thing for an author who, they've got, and this is kind of speaking from my own perspective here. I had somewhat of a little bit of a platform whenever I was coming up in journalism. I was a sports writer and I had quite a bit of a following from that. I left that world to become a teacher. So, I kind of left the content world for a few years before I started writing on the Christian side of things. But I feel like I'm still kind of building a platform of my own in the Christian side of things. And I think there's a lot of writers who are in that point where their writing is really good. It's maybe on par with anybody that you would read, but they don't have the platform. And a lot of people, and I'm kind of in this boat, don't really know the best route to take to start building a platform, or they don't know how to put the time in. So if you've maybe whenever you've talked to young writers or up and coming aspiring writers, what are some of the pieces of advice you give to writers about building their own platform?
Yeah, I try to avoid the concept of building platform because that sucks you into, I'm not going to use any names because I'll be disparaging, but there's kind of a cottage industry around platform building, which makes me feel very slimy and I don't like it. And people are profiting off of trying to get others to build platforms.
Yeah.
And so I'm not wild about that. So but building an audience is a different thing. Like just in its entity, it's a different thing. An audience is somebody who cares about your work, wants to read what you have to say, finds value in it. Usually there's a buy-in there. There's an emotional, intellectual buy-in.
Yeah.
So building an audience is a different thing than a platform. A platform is a number. It dehumanizes your readers. And as an author, that's a terrible thing to do.
Yeah, I agree.
Because if you have a dehumanized audience, it's going to affect your writing because you don't care what you're writing. You care how many people you're writing it for.
Yeah.
So that cuts the heart out of what you're writing, especially as a Christian author. But I think the same is true. Anybody who wants to tell a good story or be intellectually honest has to care about the reader. So when you think about audience, the first and foremost thing is keep publishing. Just keep publishing. So if that's a personal website, if that's starting a website with other authors, which can be a great thing to do because it's very discouraging to try to put up content yourself every day and you just see these like minuscule numbers.
Yeah.
But if there's sort of a cohort of writers and you can contribute, twice a month or whatever your capacity is, could be weekly, could be multiple times a week. And there more and more web publications are coming together to help, especially creative writers and storytellers and different things like that. So you just start to seek those out.
Yeah.
And then you just submit stuff everywhere. As you know, that's kind of how I got into it. I forget that now because I'm at a place now where I kind of write what I want when I want to, because I don't feel like I need to build the same way I did 7, 8, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But when you're building, you just never say no to an opportunity. Like I remember writing articles for like Motherhood magazine. And I'm like, well, I'm not a mom and but they want a book about or an article about being a pastor's kid or praying with your family or whatever. I'm like, okay, sure. And so you just say yes to stuff so that you build. Two things happen. One is you build a readership and then you build essentially a portfolio. So it's the same thing, a photographer or any visual artist, they have to have a portfolio of their work, a web designer. A writer needs a portfolio of their work. And, if somebody Googles you and they can find 10 articles by you, that's significant. If they find 0 articles by you, you're not a writer.
Yeah.
You're an aspiring writer.
Yeah.
So I think that's the biggest piece. And then finding a way to share your work in a way that's genuine, not self-promoting.
Yeah.
So if you write something and you believe in it, you should feel no qualms about just Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever platforms are your favorites. Just put it out there and say, and don't just do the I wrote a thing. That tweet I wrote. Nobody cares. Nobody cares that you wrote a thing. If you say
I hate that
wrote
phrase. I did a thing.
Yeah, we all did. You just tweeted a thing too, and I'm bored. So tell me what you wrote. Yeah. Give me a hook. And I don't mean like a clever marketing pitch, but just, have you ever had questions about this? Me too. I wrote about it. Okay. Yeah. Now we have a conversation. Like this is an intellectual engagement, right. Possibly emotional. Like there's a connection there. So be honest in it. And then I think the last piece I would say on this is always write stuff that you care about. Yeah. So don't write stuff that you just are, that you're completely disinterested in, because it shows over time. And it's really hard to share your work with consistency if you don't like your work with consistency, or at least you don't believe in your work consistently. So writing stuff that you have an investment in. And I struggled with that early on as a writer, because it's hard to balance that with don't say no to opportunities. Because sometimes the opportunity is something that you're like, I don't really care. Yeah. But, so you have to balance that. But when it's up to you, write the stuff that matters to you. And sometimes that means you find a niche. A lot of people will say the best thing for an aspiring writer is to find a niche. You should write consistently about, I know one guy who he wrote about millennials and faith, and that was kind of how he got his start as a writer. I was never a niche guy because I like lots of things. Right. Niches make me feel claustrophobic. But for some people, that's exactly right. Like they're going to be book reviewers. They're going to be poets. They're going to be, they have a genre, they have a niche. And that's not a bad way, because niches, it's easier to build an audience in a niche. Yeah. Because people look for a specific thing. Yeah, I've heard people say that a lot. Where write from what you know. Don't try to feign experience in some other thing that you haven't gone through or haven't experienced, because then you can't really write about it, because you haven't experienced that. So I think that's a good point. And one thing you hit on earlier was this was kind of the first book that you had where you felt like a free agent author, which I thought was interesting, because you said that you had to shop it around to different publishers and that sort of thing. So what advice can you give to people who maybe they've submitted stuff to a magazine or a publication, they've gotten a lot of rejections and they're struggling with how to deal with the rejection? How did you handle that? And what advice would you give to somebody how to handle that? Well, I have to play fair here, which is, as a published author, rejection lands very differently than it does as a not yet published author. Yeah. Because a not yet published author feels like I might never get my chance. Yeah. A published author goes, if I knock on the next door, one of these doors, I know these people, there's just a level of confidence. And this was my 4th book. If it was my 2nd book, I might still feel that way, because I didn't have a depth of kind of work under my belt. But when it was it's my 4th book, I'd published a couple different things. I'd worked at 3 different publishers. There's just a level of it's going to work out for me. Yeah. It also helps that I'm not trying to use these books to pay my bills. Yeah. I'm not trying to write for a living. So I don't have that pressure either. Yeah. What I would say to the writer who's the not yet published, who is experiencing lots of rejection, it's, keep in mind the majority of the rejections are not because of the writing. Some of them are, but you need to have an honest friend who will say, you're not very good if you're not very good. That's true with anything. Yes. Yeah. We don't need, there, you remember in American Idol, I haven't watched it in years, but the early episodes where the people come in and they think they're amazing and they get
Yeah.
rejected. And then they're like,
Simon
well, my
Cowell is
mom,
just, yeah, Simon
yeah,
Cowell is just pretty harsh to him. Yeah.
my mom likes me. And you're like, well, you need to get feedback from somebody who's not your mom, because, my mom would tell me my writing was bad, but most moms wouldn't.
Yeah.
And so I think assuming that you're a good writer, you're not probably getting rejected because of that. You're getting rejected because you're one of 800 proposals. It's like a job applicant. You might be perfectly qualified for the job, but you're buried in the stack. And so just like getting a job, connections help. So if you find somebody who knows somebody, those second and third tier connections where somebody can just get your name to the top of the stack of proposals. Boy, that's a hard sentence to say. To just get your name recognized. And writers tend to look out for other writers. There are some who are very self-protective and think this is a zero-sum game. If I help you, it's going to hurt my chances. Generally speaking, it's much more of a sharing community, I've discovered.
Yeah.
There's I will recommend your work. I'll, if you write this and post it, I'll repost it to kind of help put it out there. And that tends to be true, especially amongst Christian writers. There's not a cutthroat, because there's not a limit. Like there's not a limited audience here. It's not like if you get a reader, I don't get that reader. We can both get that reader.
Yeah.
You can like both of us. It's perfectly fine. So making those connections is a huge, huge thing. If you're looking to get published book wise, agents help a lot.
Most big houses won't even accept your proposal unless it comes from an agent.
Yeah. And I don't know how to tell people how to find an agent, frankly, because I didn't know what a literary agent was until I worked in publishing. Then I met a few through working in publishing. So when it came to the point where I wanted to work with one, I kind of had a sense of who to reach out to.
Yeah.
Which is that's just the benefits of the job that I had. But that's the case in almost anything. I mean, so I live in Nashville right now. The number of people who move here trying to make it in music and are now working at coffee shops. I assume everybody who makes me an Americano moved here for music. I assume everybody who serves me, enchiladas moved here for music. Like because that's what people do. They move here to make it. People move to New York to make it big, and then they end up like being a bartender or whatever. Writing is kind of like that, because the people who make it either luck out, like just they're the one in a million, or they have a connection. And so hustling the connections is a big one, and not in a slimy way, but in a mutually beneficial way.
Yeah, that was something you mentioned to me was whenever we had coffee earlier this year, it was something about how, you want to reach out to people and ask them for their advice, but not in a sense where you seem like you're just using them. Like it needs to be like a genuine thing. And I think most people hopefully would know how to approach that. Cause you don't want to just seem like you're using somebody to get to where you're at or where you want to be. Cause I think people can figure that out really quickly. The people who are just trying to use them, especially people who have been around the block, they've probably had a number of people that have reached out to them in the same fashion, and they can tell really quickly who's genuine and who's just trying to use them.
If you reach out to an established writer and say, I'd like to pick your brain, they know who you are. They know exactly what you're asking. If you reach out and say, hey, I'm just getting started, I would love to learn, you just postured yourself as somebody who they would like to help, probably. Now, I mean, there's not everybody has time, those kind of things, but there's even verbiage you can use that positions you as somebody who's trying to leech off of them, or somebody who's trying to genuinely learn and make it. And I recognize that when on the occasions that people reach out to me, and I don't have any problem giving time, if I can, to those who are just seeking to learn. That's a wonderful posture to be in, especially as a writer. Every writer should be in the how do I get better posture all the time.
Yeah.
But if it's the leeching posture, ain't nobody got time for that.
It's true. Yeah. And one thing that I'm curious about too is, I think we talked about this too, but I've pretty close to having a proposal done, and I just have kind of stalled in sending it out because I am a procrastinator, and that's one of my biggest issues. But
Okay, let me ask you a question. Are you a procrastinator, or is it intimidating? And that's I'm not trying to insult you, because intimidating is especially if it's a first one, like that's a scary thing.
I think it's more so intimidating. And I did send, so I attended a writing conference this summer. It was a virtual writing conference. They had a couple of agents there. We were allowed to send, it's called a one sheet. So basically you take your proposal, condense it down to one sheet. And I sent it to a couple of agents. They both liked my idea. They said that this is the kind of book they would take on, but they said my platform wasn't big enough. And so I think part of it is there's probably a level of intimidation and fear there that I'm, afraid to send it off. Not necessarily afraid to send it off, but like afraid that I would send it off, get a bunch of no's, and wonder, could I have done anything more with it? And so I know that I need to just get rid of that thought process. But, I used a template that another author recommended to me for my book proposal. And she has a book coming out with Zondervan in early 2021. So I feel like, what I'm doing, I'm using a pretty, trusted way to make it. But you mentioned to me how you would get proposals that would say, people would say like, oh, I think I'm the next Tim Keller. I think I'm the next Max Lucado. And you said, basically, don't ever do that. So what are some things that whenever you would pick up a proposal that would immediately be red flags that authors should definitely avoid?
Yeah. So, well, let me give positives for authors first on the proposal. A strong writing sample. The first thing I would do is go straight to, because usually there's like here's who I am, here's the premise of the book, here's the platform, here's comparisons with other books, etc. I would come back to that. I would go straight to the writing sample, because a good reader can tell within about a page, a few paragraphs, is this worth turning the page on?
Yeah.
And if you can get me to turn the page twice, there's momentum there. That's good.
Yeah.
So just to write the best sample you can. That's the strongest part. Then I would back up to okay, how are you positioning this? And when I say positioning, I don't just mean platform. That's a very real part of the decision-making process. But this is now we're at the red flags part. So if you're writing a Christian book and your comparisons for your book are all of the New York Times bestsellers, I do not take you seriously.
Yeah.
If I've never heard of you, I don't take you seriously, because you don't have a concept of where you are and where your book is in the marketplace.
Yeah.
If you wrote a book on faith and doubt and compare it to The Reason for God by Tim Keller, I don't take you seriously. If you compare it to Help My Unbelief by Barnabas Piper, now I'm like, oh, like you go down a handful of tiers to figure out where your book is.
Yeah.
You make intelligent comparisons. Like if you can say, so you find the books, or if you just say there's not another book on the marketplace like this, you better have some data to prove that.
Yeah, you didn't do much research.
Yeah, that mostly just sounds like you think you're special, and again, you're listening to your mom too much. But if you can compare your book intelligently to books of the same tier, so kind of knowing who the authors are, who are respected but maybe not bestsellers, who are good writers, people you respect, but like they're not making a living off of writing. They do a good job at it. Mm-hmm. And you can say, my book is like them in this ways, but here's how it differs. Here's what this book offers that those books don't. Here's how it fills a void in the industry. The other one is do you have an awareness of how many books, not an actual number, but like how saturated the marketplace is on certain books. If you want to write a marriage book, be real aware that everybody writes a marriage book, including a bunch of people who shouldn't. And so, at this point, most publishers will not pick up a marriage book unless it's from an absolute A-lister. When Matt Chandler writes a marriage book, we pay attention. When Tim Keller writes a marriage book, we pay attention. When Susie What's-Her-Face from Nowheresville writes a marriage book, like nobody cares.
Yeah.
And it just because that's who you're competing against.
Yeah.
However, if Susie What's-Her-Face from Nowheresville writes a memoir about, being in a weird homeschool cult, now people pay attention because that, like, there's something there.
Yeah.
So, you have to know your place. And so
Yeah.
the red flags are, what is your awareness? Because that also speaks to your expectations. Publishers don't want to work with an author who thinks they're going to be the next bestseller.
Yeah.
They because the publisher will always be the bad guy in that case, because they're constantly giving disappointing news. Even if a book does well, if it doesn't do next level well, the author is going to be upset. And so if you have realistic expectations, just saying, I think I offer this, I think I'm similar to these authors, but I do these things differently, I think I kind of fall in this category. The other thing is that helps the publisher understand your work. They understand you, they understand your work, they understand how to position it. The platform is still this, 800-pound gorilla in the room.
Yeah.
But those are very important aspects.
Yeah, I found that the proposal really it takes a lot of research to do one really well, because if you just kind of put the surface level information on there, then it's going to look like you didn't put a lot of effort into it.
Yeah.
And then I would assume that an agent or a publisher would say this is the same level of work you put into your writing, because it does take a lot of research to look at. And I would say, whenever you asked me earlier if it was intimidating, I think that has been the not the most, I guess it'd be the most intimidating, but it's also been the most time consuming part, is doing the research to understand, where does my idea fit into the marketplace of ideas? Yeah. What other books are similar to mine? Because I don't want to compare myself to the A-list type of books.
Frankly, if you haven't done that work, not you personally, anybody listening hasn't done that work during the writing of or prior to the writing of the book, you probably didn't write as good of a book as you could. Because, so for example, when I wrote a book on curiosity, I went and I needed to know, am I just stepping on somebody else's toes? Did I borrow a good idea by accident? Not plagiarize, but just I had the same idea as so-and-so. And so I found different books on question asking, on curiosity, on these different things. None of them in the same vein as what I was trying to do, but that allowed me to write the book as well as I could, because I'm like, I have my lane. I know what I'm trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
And it allowed me to put it on a proposal to say, hey, there are these 6 or 7 books that are out there. It's not like these for this reason. It's kind of like these, but it touches, those are more about question asking, and this is more about exploration and discovery and so forth, all of which helped shape the idea in the first place. If you're doing that work after writing the book, you might have written a book that was a whole letter grade worse than what you could have done. You could have done something that was more focused, sharper, better aimed.
Have you had an idea that you thought would become a good book, then you did the research and found out there's already a lot of books like this? And did you scrap any ideas that maybe you thought would have become books for you?
Not quite that dramatic. It's been more having ideas and then being aware of or researching what's out there and going, this needs to be this kind of book in order to not just be redundant.
Right.
So the book on happiness, there's a ton of books on happiness out there. They're everywhere. Almost all of them are from a secular perspective.
Yeah.
Which is great for me, because that just means I get to go back to the Bible repeatedly, and it offers something both better, just inherently better, and more, just profoundly foundational. But even there, where does this fall compared to books on joy, books on satisfaction, books on whatever? And so, it bullseyed it for me, so that doing that research and reading some of those books, or at least thumbing through them to get a feel for them, really helps focus. This should be this shouldn't be this. And in some cases, if I was, if I had I'm trying to think if there was anything that I've sort of chewed on and then rejected. I think it's been more like I've read other people's books and been like, man, I would have liked to have written that, but they did it first and they did it better.
Yeah.
So we're going to let them, we're going to share this book out there and put their work into the world, because they killed it on this one.
Yeah. Yeah. And you hit on something earlier that I thought was really interesting about, you mentioned that we talked about platform building, and you said that there are a lot of people that will try to profit off of authors that are looking to gain or to build their platform.
Yeah.
And what are, I guess that'd be one example, but what are some other things that you would caution authors to be aware of? Because sometimes they might go into this process and be a little naive about the industry. And there are, even in the Christian world, I would guess that there's still people that may look to take advantage in some way. So what are some
Yeah.
things that maybe you would caution authors to be aware of?
One simple one, I would not work with an agent who asks for money up front. That is a book mill. They don't believe in your work. The way that agents generally work is that you sign an agreement with them either for a specific period of time. It's kind of an exclusive partnership for a specific period of time or for a specific work, whatever you've pitched to them.
Right.
And then when that's done, maybe you re-up with them, you sign a new agreement, there's that kind of thing, but it's all percentage based. So what you agree with the publisher on in terms of an advance and royalties, the agent gets a percentage of that.
Mm-hmm.
That's their pay. If they're saying in order to work with us, when you know, it's a $500 fee, they have no incentive to take your book seriously. Or they have incentive, but like they got money up front. They can take on, that's a numbers game. If they can take on 1,000 clients, they just got $500,000 and they didn't do any work.
Yeah.
So avoid that. I think another thing to avoid is just the numbers game will never satisfy. So trying to grow your Twitter following, your Instagram following, moving in the influencer direction. And by that, I'm not trying to be snide. I mean, like there's a certain thing where you like, that is an influencer. That's a person who is, especially on like the Instagram influencer, trying to move that direction is disingenuous for almost everybody, but especially for a writer who's then going to try to pitch a heartfelt book, you know, or intellectually, you know, stimulating book.
Right.
So I think I don't know, you can't formulate numbers in an honest way, in a genuine way. What you can do, again, is forge a readership. So, you know, what you could do, rather than saying I have, you know, 50,000 Twitter followers just because I did the follow back strategy with everybody, and I followed 1,000 people and then 600 followed me back, and then I followed another 1,000 and 300 followed me back, or whatever, which a lot of people tried for a long time. And it works for numbers. It doesn't work for buy-in.
Yeah.
Is to find 500 Twitter followers, 2 of whom are respected writers, and get them your work and get blurbs from them. Get a review from them that then goes to the agent or the publisher, because if they can recognize that name and so says, this is really good.
Yeah.
You know, a good respected endorsement is, I don't know what the conversion rate is, but it's probably worth a few thousand Twitter followers. Yeah. And it leaves you feeling like you don't need to go like wash off the slime of platform building.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else that's just a landmine to avoid. I think the other thing is, this is a bit more conceptual and theological, but who reads your stuff is very much in God's hands. Yeah. I've written 4 books. None of them have been bestsellers. I have reason to be disappointed. But I hear periodically from people who do read my books, and they tell me, this helped me in this way, this opened my eyes in this way, this connected with me in this way. If I don't find that more valuable than another 5,000 in sales, I think I've gotten it backwards as a writer.
Yeah.
If I'm writing for numbers, I think I'm doing it for the wrong reason. If I'm writing for a 17-year-old pastor's kid to tell me that this book helped him make it through high school, I have my eyes pointed in the right direction. And I think at any scale that's true. And so you put the readership in God's hands, and you are as faithful as you can be with your work. And God handles the numbers. in the way that he sees fit. And some people get rich and some people never get paid, but the work is good.
Yeah. Well, if it makes you feel any better, I think I told you Help My Unbelief truly is one of my favorite books that I've read, not just this year, but in general. And oftentimes, because that's similar to what you talked about, what books are similar to what you're writing. I would say that book is pretty similar to the topic that I had for my book. But the line that you have in there, I don't know if it's word for word, but basically was that we are finite creatures trying to understand an infinite God. That has stuck with me ever since I read it. And so that book to me, I may not have been a bestseller, but it truly is one of the most helpful books that I've read, because that period of doubt and unbelief was such a dark period for me, because it was the first time I really underwent all of those emotions and didn't know how to navigate it. And so me writing has kind of been my process of going through that. But then reading your book was really illuminating, because it was coming from such a theological standpoint that a lot of things I hadn't learned before. So that's one testimony right there for your book for you.
Well, thank you. And in all honesty, hearing that from you, the first, you shared that with me early on, and when we were getting to know each other a little bit, those kinds of things are so much more meaningful than a royalty statement from my publisher. Everybody likes getting paid for their work, but writing is message. Writing is not product.
Right.
And if we turn it into a commodity and it's just a product, we will write garbage books that help nobody. If we write it as a message, whether we're writing a novel or a poem or an essay or a theological work or a memoir, it matters. It's work that matters. And it matters if 3 people read it or 300 or 300,000. So I think that's the thing that writers need to hold on to tightly as much as anything, because that's the thing that gets you to sit down at the keyboard or the notebook or whatever tomorrow and churn out the next thing. Mm-hmm. Is this matters. It matters because I'm pouring as much truth into it in as quality a way as I can.
Yeah. I think, it's just like anything. You got to love the actual craft of it. And I said the same thing when I interviewed. I got back into teaching this year, and they asked me, just my thoughts on like building relationships with kids. And I said, you can't go into teaching without actually loving it, because it's too hard of a job. And I feel like
Yeah.
writing is very similar though. Like, and that's true with any craft, I think. But like, you've got to really love it to sit down and actually do the hard work, because some days you're going to write words that you're going to want to throw away tomorrow, and you got to just be okay with that.
Yeah. Well, and that's, yes. All of us have deleted more words than we've published. I mean, and that's true for like Stephen King, who writes a 1,000-page book every 7 minutes. Like he still deletes more words than he's written. It's the way it is. But it's kind of analogous to like the Christian life. There's so many like 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps back kind of aspect to it in terms of progress and growth and sanctification that. Yeah, writing is, if you take it seriously, it will be really humbling and profoundly fulfilling as well.
Yeah. In like a kind of a capsule way, can you describe just what your writing process is? Maybe it changes book to book, but you don't have to go super in depth, but whenever you start the process, say you've got an idea for a book and you want to start actually writing it. Because I feel like for some writers that can be a really daunting task, is like, where do I even begin? What does your writing process look like?
Yeah, it's I'll back off to like the germination of an idea and walk it through. And again, not in so much detail that we get bored. Once you get into writing, you kind of see everything through the eyes of a writer, meaning, is this a good idea to write about? Do I have something to like, you just, and you start collecting these ideas. So step 1 is, how are you collecting the ideas? I mean, do you have, I think, in Bird by Bird, Anne Lamott talks about carrying like 3x5 cards that she'll write down a phrase or something she saw, or she just collects them and then periodically spreads them out on her desk and discards most of them and keeps a few. Yeah. You can use Evernote, you can use notes on your phone, you can use the voice recordings, whatever, but just start collecting ideas. At some point for me, an idea is like a burr in the saddle. Like it's the one that my mind keeps coming back to, or I see it repeatedly in some form. So take the book that I just released, Hoping for Happiness. I started to just see thematic things in my life, in conversations with others, in observation of others, that there's this, we have a weird relationship with happiness as Christians. Okay, well, what is that? And so just started writing down things that I heard, things that I felt in myself, things that I observed in myself. And I thought maybe there's enough here for, I don't know if this is a couple of blog posts. I don't know if this is an article. I don't know if this is a book. And then started reading Ecclesiastes, which those two things were not related. I kind of tripped into Ecclesiastes, but started seeing it differently in light of this pursuit of happiness that we're all kind of part of, or this suspicion of happiness that some of us have. And Ecclesiastes started to just be this depth of stuff. So, okay, now there's a bunch of notes. And now all of a sudden I look at this and I go, I think there's a whole, I think I can get 30,000 to 50,000 words out of this is really what it came down to. This is not 2 blog posts.
Yeah.
Well, once I decided that, or once I got that sense, then it's a matter of, okay, well, what 50,000 words? That's back to what we were talking about earlier. What else is out there? What is this? What direction is this? Because again, it's still just sort of a mishmash of ideas. It's like walking through the grocery store, like there's ingredients for a lot of things here, but what are we going to make? And so just started to kind of hone in, and you have to have some sense of self-awareness. What can I do? I can't write the same kind of book that like Donald Miller writes. He's a different writer than I am. So are most people. So like, what can I do? So you hone in on that, you hone in on what else is out there, and it just becomes a pile of notes for me, at which point it's organization, some loose sense of organization to trim some of this down, to figure out how it fits. That's not a chapter outline at that point, but it is call it a concept outline, just blocks of ideas that seem to fit together. So for me, those ideas were, is happiness even possible in this life? Because a lot of people seem to be chasing it and never finding it. Okay, so there's a big question.
Yeah.
Seems like happiness is tied to expectations, because disappointment is just an unmet expectation. Okay, there's an idea. Okay, well, what do we do with our expectations? How do we build them? What are they based on? Okay, there's an idea. And that kind of thing, just blocking it out. At which point I looked at it and thought, okay, I think I have enough here. Started to work it out. Called my agent and said, hey, here's my idea. He said, that's a good idea. Flesh it out. So then it gets into now we're into, I'm going to start writing this thing. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I don't know if I'm going to write something that will end up being published, or this is just kind of my initial hack at it. But I wrote an introduction and a chapter or two based on those ideas, took them to him, and he started taking those around. Once a publisher, in this case, the Good Book Company, picked it up, then it was working with an editor to really refine those ideas. Then it's a chapter outline. So chapter 1 is going to be this, and it's going to cover this specific question or set of ideas. Chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4. And then once I'm in that phase, I'm no longer collecting information. As I write, I'm pulling quotes and different things for examples, and I'm still, deeply trying to, dig into scripture so it's feeding into it. But once the publisher says, yes, we want this, I have a contract with them to write a certain kind of thing. So I can't veer off anymore. Like this is, right. There's a defined framework. At that point, that's when the work happens. Prior to that, it kind of feels like exploration. There's some work to be done, on proposals and things, but mostly it's just sort of like, that's the exciting part. Now we're down to this is no longer exciting. Now we're working. Mm-hmm. And it's just chapter by chapter. I outline by hand. So I have a notebook with just mad scribbles in it, because it's framework, it's specific phrases I want to get in there. And I find outlining by hand to be so valuable because it's more methodical.
Yeah.
Which helps me recognize where the gaps are in my ideas. It stops me from being redundant. It imprints it on my mind a little bit more. It's easier for me to see this is a hole that needs to be filled in with an example. I'm going to handwrite out some specific phrases or sentences that just hooked in my mind. I'm like I've got to get this in there. This is kind of a key pivot phrase kind of thing. And then I moved from there to just the writing, and I'm not a rough drafter in the sense of just throwing down kind of just a hammer it out draft and then go back and edit.
Yeah.
I hate editing. Also, I can't move from paragraph to paragraph until I think the previous one is pretty close to publishing.
Kind of how I feel too whenever I write. Yeah.
And I don't get hung up on it too much because so much of that outlining process on paper cleans up my ideas so that once I get to the writing, I'd say it's 70-ish% there, getting close. So, then it's writing. And then it's a matter of what the relationship with the publisher is. My publisher they wanted me to turn it in chapter by chapter to edit as we go. Which I really didn't like at first, but I did find a lot of benefit in because it meant that every time I moved on to a next chapter, I had a much better sense. So by halfway through the book, I had a good sense of their expectations, a really good sense of what was already in play. And that gives clear direction. Whereas if you write the whole thing and turn it in and they come back with just massive edits, it kind of feels like you failed.
Yeah.
It feels like, you got a D- on that.
Yeah.
instead of working with the teacher as you go. And it helps that I had a great editor who did not do anything to diminish my voice and believed fully in the book and all of her input was very much about keeping the message and the voice sharp.
Yeah.
And she really helped it improve. That's kind of the arc of my writing process. Then there's the editing process, whatever. I don't love that, but I have found that working well with editors tends to help my writing. Being cantankerous towards editors, save your bullets. There are a few places where you're going to want to put your foot down and say, I'm not changing that.
Yeah.
But if like 9 out of 10 you're willing to say, or 19 out of 20, you're willing to say, cool, I'll follow your suggestion. I'll make some changes. And then that one time you go, I'm not taking that out.
Yeah. Because then you get a reputation of not being easy to work with too, which is something that you want to avoid as an author. You don't want to be labeled as hard to work with, because then publishers might be a little bit more reluctant to take a stab at your work. I would assume maybe that's not the case, but
if nothing else, it's just not very kind.
Yeah.
The editor is doing his or her best. I hope there are times you can have I have worked with one or two editors who I thought were bad at their jobs and didn't care about my book. And so I was less inclined to work with them in a partnership way. But when there's an invested editor who makes an effort to really get it, to get what you're trying to do, and to take what you're trying to do and bring it from it's good to it's really good. Like you feel great about it.
Yeah.
Those editors are easy to trust. And those editors also are more understanding when you go back and say, I can't change this because of this reason. Like this is an example I have to have in there. So for example, this is a very minor example, but it's the one that sticks in my head because there was also a bit of a cultural breakdown. My publisher is British and the editor is an English lady. And so I had a line in there about something about it'll be sadder than a Jason Isbell song, which is admittedly kind of a niche comment.
Right.
For those who don't know, he's kind of a Southern rocker, singer, songwriter, Americana artist who writes the best heartbreak songs.
Yeah.
But apparently a 30-something editor from England doesn't know that. His Jason Isbell's audience doesn't extend to the London area, apparently. So she just said, I think we need to change this. I don't know who he is. And that was one where I was like, I don't care. It doesn't matter to me that you don't know. This is one that like the reference works if you don't know, because you can at least say it's sadder than a song written by a guy who writes sad songs.
Right.
Or you can look him up. Or if you know, then it hits the nail right on the head. So I was
Yeah.
like, nope, that one's staying in there.
Yeah.
And she was like, okay, because I just, most of the time I was willing to flex. So there are those examples where you're like, no, I really like this line and I'm not taking it out.
Yeah. I remember you posted on Facebook earlier this year and on Twitter, I think, but you had a paragraph that you cut out of your writing, and you were like, I was so proud of this, but I knew I had to edit it, and now it's just sent off into the ethos where I don't even know where it exists anymore. And you were kind of describing your editing process. I thought that was really funny because that's true. It's like I had a professor in college whenever I was in a multimedia class, and we had to do a lot of audio production stuff. And she said, like, I've never missed a piece of audio that I had to cut. And I found that to be true, where it was like we had to pare down like a bunch of audio into like a 1.5 minute segment. And I feel like it's probably got to be the same thing with your editing, where it's like you're super shrewd about what needs to be in there or what doesn't need to be in there.
Well, and that's where good. I'm not great at that for myself, because some of the stuff that my editor asked me to cut was stuff that I was really proud of, because it was, I would say, at the risk of sounding arrogant, it was really well written. It just didn't further, like, it didn't get the reader to turn the page in a timely fashion.
Yeah.
It just created more words on the page. And so there was a little bit of sort of that, because writers, especially writers who really, like, you get on a roll, sometimes you write a needless paragraph because you just think the groove is so good. It's a little bit like when the guitar soloist just kind of goes off for like 30 seconds too long.
Yeah.
Because he's just like, he's in a groove, and it kind of derails, like, okay, the concert experience. You're like, what do we do now?
Yeah.
There's a touch of that. So she just cut some of that out, and I was like, but it was a great paragraph. But it was a great paragraph that didn't further the work.
Yeah.
So a good editor recognizes that they're not cutting stuff just to cut. They're cutting because if we move from here to here and we take this paragraph out, the reader gets into the next important piece in the timely, like, it serves the reader well. That's really what a good editor is trying to help you do.
Yeah. Well, is there anything I didn't ask about that maybe you feel like is another pertinent thing that writers should know? Or I feel like we covered a lot, but is there anything that maybe you feel like is especially important to know that I didn't ask about?
Man. Well, one thing, and I'm gonna mention one specific option of this, but it's not the only one out there. Things like writers cohorts can be really beneficial to those who, kind of wherever you are. I mean, if you've published 5 books and whatever, maybe it's not quite as helpful. But if you're on the, I'm not yet published, or I write for a couple different websites, but I really want to up my writing quality and maybe my writing opportunities, a writing cohort kind of thing. You mentioned a writers conference. There's some similarities there, but there's the one that I was going to mention. There's a group called Gospel Centered Discipleship. I think it's just gcdiscipleship.com. Yeah, that's right. They do one. And so usually it covers several months, these kind of things. And you're in there with, I don't know, 7 to 12 other writers. So, and you're turning in projects, you're hearing from other published authors and writers to kind of help guide you through specific pieces. But it's a really disciplined and communal way to improve as a writer, and to make some connections. Because again, if somebody else in there writes for a website that you don't, there you go. Maybe there's your next opportunity. And those kinds of things can be really valuable if you have the time, and they usually have a cost attached to them, and the money to put into it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would just say that finding those, it's a little bit like interning. When you intern in college, that might be your first job. You kind of build those professional connections. You build a little bit of a relationships, reputation. Writing cohorts can be like that as well. So that kind of thing, writers conference, just make sure it's a reliable one. You mentioned a group before we jumped on here that's headed by a lady who we both have a lot of respect for. So just make sure the people who run it are legit.
Yeah.
And that, you're going to get something out of it. But that's probably the last thing I would say.
That's great. So I always ask one final question, and I'll kind of put a spin on it here. So typically I ask, what do you kind of do to slow down whenever your life is busy? But I guess we'll look at it from a writing perspective. Whenever you're in the process of writing a book and you kind of need to take a mental break, or just writing in general, what do you do to kind of recenter your thoughts and just sort of, recalibrate, I guess?
Yeah. I think that depends. It depends on a handful of factors. I tend to find that my version of writer's block comes from mental fatigue. It's not that might be, there might be a different type of writer's block for like creative writers, fiction writers, that kind of thing, where they're like, I don't know where the story goes from here. For me, it's almost always just, I've run out of thought.
Yeah.
And so it can be as simple as go for a run, go for a hike, take a nap. But usually I need more than like a couple hours. So it's really, it can be unplugging for a weekend, just sort of like shutting it down on a Saturday morning when I'm just hit a wall and just saying, I'm not looking at this until the next time I have scheduled to write on Monday evening or something. And that's okay. Like I don't believe that you need to write every day to be a good writer.
Yeah.
I believe that you need to do something to enhance your writing every day. And sometimes that's watching football. Just because you just, or watching a movie or playing with your kids or whatever, like something to let your brain just breathe.
Yeah.
Because writing is taxing. And so just giving yourself a chance to do that and recognizing that like you're going to get back into this. I think sometimes we feel like taking a break from writing is like summer vacation when you were a kid and you get back to school and don't remember how to do math. Writing's not like that. Yeah. You're going to get back there and you're going to read the last page you wrote and you might think, ooh, that's terrible. But you're going to remember where you were. You're going to kind of warm up for a second and then you're going to be able to get back into it. So just the ability to give yourself permission to go, I'm not touching this for 3 days because I need 3 days.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Unless you're on a deadline.
Well, Barnabas, thank you so much for this insight. I know, I definitely have, I'm going to value this information personally, and I hope the people that are listening that are writers or aspiring authors will as well. If people want to connect with you, what's kind of the best way for them to, I know you're on Twitter and Facebook and all that, but what's the best way to connect with you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Barnabas Piper. I'm probably the most interactive on Twitter of most platforms. It's, it's a great place to kind of have conversations and intersect with people there. I'm on Instagram. And then barnabaspiper.com is my website. You can find the podcast that I'm on. And it's kind of just a clearinghouse for stuff that I've written recently. So those would be the best places.
And they could order your book on your website too, I assume?
Yep. If you go to barnabaspiper.com, there's a books tab. So you can see all the books there, but the most recent one's right at the top.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much. This is awesome.
Thank you so much.